Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in. We are continuing the hearing of submissions on Plan Change 7 of the Land and Water Regional Plan. And this afternoon, we start with the submission of Ravensdown. Is there anyone here to represent Ravensdown? Thank you very much. Now, we have, of course, the original submission. We have evidence statements from Mr. Roberts, Ms. Wilkes and Ms. Taylor, and an update from Ms. Taylor as well. So we've read all of those, and we're looking forward to whatever you want to say to enhance our understanding of the materials that we've been reading.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Shepherd. I'm Anna Wilkes, Ravensdown's Environmental and Policy Manager, and I have our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Ernst Roberts, with me, and also Carmen Taylor to my left from planning witness from Plans Consultants. I don't have anything particular to add to my statement of evidence that you won't have already read, so I'm happy to take questions, and I understand that my two accomplices are in a similar position.
Thank you very much. Let's start then with yourself, Ms. Wilkes. Commissioner Van Voorthuysen, have you any questions to ask of Ms. Wilkes concerning this?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one at your paragraph 4.6 in your evidence in chief. And I think I might have misunderstood this incorrectly, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Are you asking to reduce nitrate concentrations by 30% from all your industrial activities combined, rather than 30% from each individual industrial activity?
So to clarify that, so what's been proposed in Plan Change 7 is an absolute 30% reduction from current consented limits from not just our activity but all industrial activities, and our position is that, and while for our own site, our bulk store site at Seadown, which has a stormwater discharge, we are able, with some challenges, but we consider that we're able to achieve that reduction. However, to better recognise those activities that may be having a small impact and or may already be operating at good management practice or best management practice, that those reductions may be very difficult to achieve to the extent that they may impact on the viability of those businesses. So perhaps it might be better to align with the zipper recommendation, which was to aggregate the 30% reduction, which might infer that some industries may in fact need to make a greater than 30% and to recognise those activities where that 30% may not in fact either be achievable or warranted in terms of the scale of impact.
Okay, well that explains it perfectly, thank you. I have no further questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Wilkes. Shall we go to Mr. Roberts next?
Certainly.
Good afternoon, Mr. Roberts.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say to correct or update your evidence, or you're ready for questions, are you?
Yes, I'm ready for questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Roberts, Commissioner Van Voorthuysen?
Yeah, Dr. Roberts, just a couple of questions. In your summary, you referred to in-loss rates of up to 300 kg in per hectare per year for commercial vegetable production. Just curious to know the provenance of those figures. How are they measured? Where were the crops grown? Were they average or median losses, etc.? Can you help clarify that?
Yes, they're from a range of publications, which I think is in the evidence in table. Let me see now. So basically, paragraph 4.1, table 1.
Yep.
So there's a range presented by Williams et al. And Francis et al., which both worked for either plant and food or crop and food as it was back then. The range they quoted was 80 to 292. Now, some of those, with a mean of 177. So those have been taken from, I know, from the Pukekohe region, for example. They will have also been measured in the Hawke's Bay and potentially in Canterbury as well. So it covers a range of crop methodologies, soils, climates, etc.
Yeah. And just one other matter, we've heard from other submitters that some people say that Overseer doesn't model nutrient loss from some small seed crops like brassicas and radish, etc. very well. And so the users of Overseer use a substitute such as ryegrass or clover instead. But we've also heard that that's not particularly helpful or useful or representative of the in-loss from the actual crop they're trying to replicate to model. Do you have any comments on that?
Yep, I do. It's absolutely true that not every crop is represented in Overseer. The reason for that is that there are no trials based around a lot of those crops that are grown. That, there's been no measurements, there's been no mass balancing of the nutrient cycles in those crops, etc. So the general principles of nutrient cycling for crops in general are basically what's used. Essentially in the arable model, which is what they're talking about, that's in the evidence as well, it's simply a mass balance type approach because of the limitations of research that's available with which to build a mathematical model of real life. So there has been, particularly in Canterbury, a long-standing group of people who do Overseer modelling for farmers and growers, including the council, etc., as a working group to try and agree on the ways of modelling things in Overseer which aren't attributable to the input structure of Overseer. For example, small seeds, and that was agreed by the working group, as I was part of it for a while, that ryegrass seeds or clover seed or whatever was the most appropriate substitute. Not perfect, but it's a way of getting it done. In terms of the cultural management, Overseer, putting in a crop is pretty standard. They use similar techniques, etc. So all of those are there. It's just the interaction between the crop and the nutrient that may not be perfectly represented. Okay. But of course, we know that Overseer is not a perfect representation of the real world anyway.
Yeah. I guess the key thing I take from that is that where substitutes are used, particularly those examples, they've been endorsed by that working group.
That's my understanding, yep.
Yeah. Okay. No further questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Well, thank you. May we come now to Ms. Taylor. And Ms. Taylor, we do appreciate that you've taken the trouble to prepare an update, and we value that you've done that. Thank you. Is there any correction or any further update that you want to mention before we come to questions?
No, I've got nothing further to add to my update or my previous evidence except for the update.
Thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
I just have one, and it's your evidence update at paragraph 2.7. The second sentence regarding nitrogen loss reductions, what do you mean by should be achieved in time? Do you mean they're on track to be achieved in time, or that they must wait to be achieved in time?
I'm referring to the framework that I'm proposing for PC7, where good management practice, farm environment plans, and further reductions for farming activities in the specific areas in OTOP, sub-regions and WIMAC are proposed, and that as those processes come into play or come into force, we will see the changes arising from those in terms of nitrogen loss reductions. That's what I mean.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm still not clear if you've answered the question. With regard to, I'm talking about with regard to the first two priorities of Te Manawa Te Wai.
Yeah.
Are you saying that those two priorities should be achieved in time? And in other words, they're on track to be achieved in time, or they must wait to be achieved in time?
Through the provisions in PC7 that are instituting a change in terms of requiring nitrogen loss reductions, that's what I'm talking about in terms of the time for that to kick in.
Right. So in other words, they are on track to be achieved in time?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have no further questions, thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, well, Ms Taylor, I was going to ask about the same sentence. It's probably rushing through reading all the things that we have to read. We didn't pause and reread it to grasp the meaning. So thank you for clarifying that for us. And thank you all for your efforts in making clear the Ravensdown case to us. We're grateful to you, and thank you for coming in today.
Is it possible, could I ask a question of Commissioner von Verthuizen? Well,
we're here to listen to you,
okay.
Not to tell you. But
right.
You can try the question, and we'll see whether he feels inclined to answer it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I was watching the evidence presented the other day by Mr. Hawkins on the impact of the change in the plant available water values for Lismore and Rakaia soils, and he showed you the impact that had on 5 farms that he'd remodelled. And you asked the question, so this will reduce, if it's accepted that the Lismore is a more representative soil to represent the MGM table, this would reduce the N loss estimates from Overseer, which was correct by about 22% on average. And you asked, so if the MGM N loss figure is lower, will that make it more difficult for farmers to achieve percentage losses on that low? So my question is, did you get a sufficient answer to that question?
Yes.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. What's your understanding of what you were told?
I'm not here to answer your questions, Dr. Roberts.
Oh, okay, sorry. So, yeah, okay, so...
You could do a point of clarification.
Yeah, so my answer would have been the less N that you lose, the harder it is to reduce the smaller losses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a better way of proceeding.
I'm sorry, Your Honour, for misbehaving.
We'd expect nothing less of you, Dr. Roberts.
Cheers. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we come to the submission of Larundel Dairy Partnership. Are they represented here? Yes. Now we have from the Larundel Dairy Partnership an original submission, further submission, statement by Mr. Fulton, statement by Mr. McKercher, a statement by Mr. Sutton, and a summary statement. So you've done well in making sure that we're properly informed about what your case is. And in addition, you've come today, and that will help us further. Is one of you going to speak first? Have you agreed on who's going to
Yes.
speak? Yes.
Yes, Commissioner. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to our submission and evidence today on behalf of Larundel Dairy Partnership, or LDP for short. My name is Brad Sutton, and my family are shareholding partners of LDP. As you've summarised, Commissioner, we understand our submission and statement of evidence has been read, and today we seek to just outline the key points of these documents, emphasising our main concerns that we have and the considerations we would like you, the Commissioners, to undertake. I'll just introduce the people here with me today. Gordon and Wendy Fulton, who are founding partners of LDP. Graham Sutton, who is also a founding partner. And Ben and Tracy McKercher, who along with their family operate the farm as contract milkers. I'll just ask Gordon Fulton now to give a brief overview, followed by Ben McKercher, who will speak to the farming operation and the good management practices that we undertake, and also summarise the significant investment in environmental improvements that we have made. Thank you, Gordon.
Over the past 55 years, Larundel has been developed from a rundown sheep and cropping farm into a high-performing dairy farm collectively owned and operated by 4 farming families. Since converting to dairying and installing pivot irrigation over most of the property, we have realised considerable improvements in both the soil and in productivity. The environment has been at the forefront of decision-making by Larundel over the last 11 years. We recognise and commit to the need to improve water quality both for now and the future. We understand that if we look after the land, it will look after us. When my father bought the property in 1965, it was a typical dry land property, and we installed irrigation and tried to improve it. But by the time we got to the year 2000, it was running 3,500 ewes, 1,000 hoggets and 100 hectares of crop, but the financial returns were only break even. So when Waimak Irrigation increased the size of the races through the property, I decided to sell part of the property as dairying seemed to be the best option for the family. We sold 361 hectares by deadline private treaty with the intention of it being converted to dairying and ourselves being a partner in the conversion. And we're fortunate to do so, and we still have all our current partners from that time. Looking back on this decision some 20 years later, as a family, we realised what an opportunity dairy farming has given us. I had 4 sons, and there was no way really that we could achieve that one of them could ever take the property over and leave anything for my wife and myself. I would argue that if agriculture in our region had been allowed to wither in the way that it might under the present nutrient management rules, families like ours would never have had an opportunity to develop viable, valuable careers like my sons have done. Agriculture is a huge economic engine, and it must not only be maintained but nourished. Since the property was converted to dairying and pivot irrigation installed, the change in the soil structure and the dry matter production has just been amazing. The water levels in the wells are considerably higher, with the shallowest well pump at 6 metres, and it hasn't gone dry in 20 years prior to the irrigation being installed with Waimak Irrigation. In a low rainfall period, the wells could go dry. The wetter areas have been fenced off and drains dug to allow water to drain off the property. Without irrigation in the 60s and 70s, pastures did not last long, and I've seen the water races on the farm fill up with sheep dung when the nor'west winds blew. The channels where the undercurrent ran to the east of our property, running back towards the coast, have been filled in further down, built on and altered to the detriment of our area and the Waimak district. Flooding has occurred in these areas where houses were allowed to be built in areas that were traditionally flooded and will continue to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fulton. Any questions for Mr. Fulton, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No, I don't have any questions of clarification arising from either of the two documents that you've provided. But I would just like to let you know that I did find it very useful, and in many ways it presents a concise summary of the issues that have been presented to us by a number of other submitters, particularly those Waimakariri Irrigation Limited shareholders and the farmers who find themselves within the Waimak nitrogen priority areas. So thank you for putting the effort in.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no
Questions?
questions, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fulton. Which of you will speak next?
Mr McKercher, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Larundel strives for continuous improvement. Our good management practices include the use of regen soil moisture monitoring to inform irrigation scheduling and decision making, monitoring and measuring all irrigation takes, using our farm environment plan to monitor performance and drive change to improve the environmental impact of our farming activities. We are engaged in the audit process to assess how the business is performing and its environmental objectives and identifying areas to focus on. There's been significant investment in efficient irrigation infrastructure and improved effluent storage, treatment and application methods. We have extensive native planting and fencing off waterways and buffer strips, and retiring approximately 3.2 hectares of land under the Burgess Stream Enhancement Initiative supporting biodiversity and mahingakai considerations. We have showcased many of our good management practices by hosting many discussion groups, Fonterra Open Days, and an Environment Canterbury and Ministry for the Environment Field Day on the property. We believe in giving back to the community and being a role model to others in the farming community. Larundel is well on the journey of making end-loss reductions. This has been achieved through significant, over $2 million, and continuous investment into environmental improvements and best management practices, as set out in our statement of evidence. We are committed to the ongoing improvements to the extent we can. However, to continue making improvements and environmental gains, we need certainty of a clear, viable future in farming. Although increasingly environmental regulations have been factors in our decision making over the last decade or so, it is very difficult to predict, even in the extreme, how far such regulations would reach. And the scale of change proposed in Plan Change 7 is far in excess of anything reasonably contemplated. We certainly never expected 90% end-loss reductions over the next 60 years to be introduced and have not prepared for such significant change. Under the current Plan Change 7 framework, we cannot see any pathway for Larundel to operate as at any viable farm system level. The proposed plan change gives no recognition or consideration to the significant gains already made in environmental improvements on farm. Instead, it plunges us over time into irreversible crippling debt, and current proposed Plan Change 7 would mean the huge investment we have made into environmental improvements and initiatives would be wasted. It would move us far beyond the good management practice example that Environment Canterbury, the Ministry for the Environment and Fonterra have championed at Larundel over the past 10 years. It would destroy our farm value and leave us feeling entirely lost. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Mr. McKercher. This is what we're here to listen to and to hear what you've got to say, and we'll see if there's any questions for you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have none either, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. McKercher. You've plainly explained your position to us in a clear way so that we can understand it. Now, who's going to speak next?
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll just like to
Back
summarise.
to you.
Yep, summarise the key concerns that we have regarding Plan Change 7, and the first of these is around the uncertainty of the starting point. Currently, Larundel's losses and farm environment plan are managed through the Waimakariri irrigation scheme. Under PC7 in its current form, Larundel would be required to manage its losses through the farm portal, and we have considerable concerns over the Environment Canterbury portal modelling and the in-loss numbers it produces. From our own observations and discussions with others, we understand the portal to be erroneous and the proxies wrong and not working accurately. This makes portal baseline GMP very uncertain and in our case impossible to meet. We are concerned that Plan Change 7 is based on an inaccurate modelling that does not align with actual measured data. Given the huge economic impacts that the plan change will have, we consider that the reductions required would only be justified if they reflected measured data or a model that aligns with measured data. Further, we consider it entirely illogical that most of our farm is in sub-area E, nitrate predator sub-area E, the purple zone, while some of it is in fact in sub-area A, the zone that requires the least amount of reduction. In fact, on our property, the two zones are actually within the same paddocks, with no obvious geographical divide between these areas. This appears nonsensical, and we assume this can only illustrate the inadequate and inaccurate modelling upon which the plan change is based. We do not think that Plan Change 7 adequately addresses the high level of uncertainty that is apparent from the catchment modelling undertaken, and we understand that Waimakariri Irrigation Limited has presented expert evidence on this. Another concern I'd like to just outline is the severe economic impact that this will have. As pointed out by Mr McKercher, even though Larundel has invested heavily in environmental improvements, we have grave concerns that the six stages of reduction required in sub-area E will destroy the future viability of our farm. We currently have a farm profit of $2,200 per hectare, including debt servicing before tax. Under Plan Change 7, this would become a $2,300 loss per hectare. This is completely insolvent. The reductions required over the next 60 years would require Larundel to meet an in-loss, if followed out through that entire time, of 4.9 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, 90% reduction. This is simply not practical and would not allow any form of farming at all. We can only assume it might equate to native vegetation or similar across the entire property. Excuse me. It is important to emphasise that to date our environmental investments have been made willingly and without significant environmental regulation, which has meant that our banks have been willing to help us invest in these environmental improvements and initiatives. Plan Change 7 introduces so much uncertainty that banks are unlikely to support any investment in farming in the Waimakariri district in the future, particularly for land in sub-area E, whether it is for environmental outcomes or not. Our farming community needs recognition and consideration to the economic impacts that not only individual farmers, but the Waimak district and the wider Canterbury region will have. As stated in our evidence, the impact of an unviable agricultural sector will lead to significant decrease in spending with our local suppliers, widespread loss of jobs, both on farms and the wider service industries. Right now, more than ever, this is the last thing we need. As the country and economy recover from COVID-19, agriculture is a hugely important engine that will provide the income to do this, and it is the backbone of the entire country. We consider that there needs to be, sorry, this is a further concern, and it's relating to equality amongst WIL shareholders. We consider that there needs to be equality and fairness among all WIL shareholders. If the burden of Plan Change 7 is managed cooperatively, it is much more likely to be successful. It would enable the farming community to come together and achieve the outcomes and give each other confidence. We see the WIL scheme as an important conduit to achieving the environmental outcomes sought through Plan Change 7. However, the nitrate priority sub-areas and differentiation between farming types proposed divides farmers, divides WIL shareholders and divides the farming community. We would respectfully ask that you, the Commissioners, take steps to ensure that a clear, robust and defined starting point is established, that it is realistic, achievable and recognises the significant investment, good management practices and in-loss reductions that have already been achieved. In the immediate case of Larundel, this could be to continue through the current WIL Farm Environment Plan and in-loss framework, or an alternative pathways or matrix management matrix approach. From a clear, robust starting point, we believe that for Larundel, the first stages of reductions are achievable, i.e. 15% through to 2030, and with robust measuring and monitoring, if required, a further 15% could be justified to meet water quality outcomes if necessary. We ask that you remove the nitrate priority sub-areas and categorisation of different farming types so that everyone is treated equally and can achieve the outcomes in unity. Equal and achievable reductions would provide a much greater incentive for the wider community to address nutrient issues on a collective basis. Table 8.9 should be much reduced so that the reductions should only be required through to 2030, with the potential for reductions to 2040 if justified on measured data. And finally, Larundel is supportive of the Waimea Irrigation's solutions package and seeks that it is adopted alongside the relief that we have sought in our submission. Thank you very much for taking the time to hear us here today. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you, Mr Sutton. Any questions, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yeah, just one question that occurred to me as you were reading it out. I'd earlier indicated I didn't have a question. I think your concluding remarks and your summary statement clearly set out what you're asking us to do. But as you were speaking, just at your para 23, understand what you're saying about removing the sub-areas so that there's just one zone, nitrogen priority area applying across the whole mapped areas rather than the different colours. Understand that. But then you say, and removing the categorisation of different farming types. So currently table 8-9, if we just look at sub-area A, 15% for dairy and 5% for all others. So when you say remove the categorisation, what exactly were you thinking of in that regard?
Just that there be more equal reductions across farming types.
So would everyone do 15%?
I'd need to think about that and come back to you.
Yeah, if you just maybe refresh in your mind what Table
Yep.
8.9 currently has. It has two categories, dairy and then all other.
Yep.
Dairy is, and this is just by 2030, in sub-area A. Dairy is 15 and all other is 5. So just if you maybe think about what you meant by removing the categorisation and come back to
I guess it's more around the division of between different farming and how that can divide shareholders within the irrigation scheme, rather more
right
around WIL working that in that collective space.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll do that and
Yeah.
refresh that and come back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, because it's our job to think what, if any, changes should be made to the provisions. So just like to be clear what you were thinking of there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr Sutton, you did a good summary of the key points as I remembered them and brought them clearly to attention again. You would also, I think, want to have have me clear in my mind that the business, thinking of it as a business, is providing a living for many people and it's producing healthy food.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes, 100%.
Yes. Well, I've got that clear in my mind too then. Thank you very much. Now, I think that really concludes what our business is with you today. Is it? Was there something else?
Excuse me, if it's appropriate, just in terms of the question that was asked, Mr. Graham Sutton believes he can add some more. Input to that. Is that all right?
Is this Mr. Sutton Senior?
Correct.
It is, Commissioner, yes.
Welcome.
If I could just make an overarching comment in terms of some of what we're supporting, particularly in terms of supporting Waimaka Irrigation Company. And also, I was watching this morning, and I have enjoyed watching the YouTubes from my home in Nelson, the submission that was made by the Waimak District Council and Dan Gordon referring to the zone committees, and I do that on the background of spending 10 years as chairman of Irrigation New Zealand, dating back to the early 2000s, and in that time spent 5 years working on the Canterbury Water Management Strategy Plan, and out of that came the zone committees. And I think that's a model that was accepted by all stakeholders in the Waimak, from farming right through to urban people. And I think that's what Dan Gordon was saying, really, that that's a good place to perhaps go back to, because I think Plan Change 7, in the minds of most people that were in that process, think that this is a bridge too far. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, we certainly remember what Mr. Gordon had to tell us and the visit that he made to us. Thank you very much for the reminder. Anything more that you'd like to add, any of you? Well, thank you for coming in. We do appreciate it. Next, we have a submission on a slightly different angle, which is the submission of Water and Wildlife Habitat Trust.
My name is Mike Patchett. I'm Chair of the Water and Wildlife Habitat Trust, and I'd firstly like to thank you for hearing our constructive critique of the proposed Plan Change 7 of the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. The Water and Wildlife Habitat Trust has a mission of conserving and rehabilitating and sustainably managing freshwater ecosystems and their wildlife. Today we see many waterways in Canterbury that are no longer swimmable and whose aquatic life and fish stocks are depleted and struggling. The quality of life of our future generations of young people is being compromised. The Trust appreciates and supports the collaborative journey, although it be a long one, of the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan that sets out the planning framework for the management of land and water resources in Canterbury and for implementing the Canterbury Water Management Strategy to improve our freshwater outcomes. However, achieving the desired freshwater outcomes will require more reason and will to change our behaviours, including adaptation to climate change and much more resource commitments. We think there is a game changer in the room. Central Government's new Essential Freshwater Package should have a significant effect on the regional plan, as it introduces new rules and regulations which are designed to stop further degradation of New Zealand's freshwater resources, improve our water quality, reverse past damage, and bring New Zealand's freshwater resources, waterways and ecosystems to a healthy state within a generation, some 30 years. The new hierarchy of obligations places the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems first, in contrast to the economic development priorities of the past. In many ways, our submission for a stronger regional plan reflects the national policy reforms that are before us. Consequently, we believe that the current plan change process should be diverted and parked and reworked in a way which brings back it in a form which is consistent with the new national policies for fresh water. However, we are heading in the right direction, but not strongly enough in our view. The proposed improvements to the regional plan are supported in principle, yet need to be strengthened to achieve the desired freshwater outcomes within that generation. We do need to add a few elements to it that we feel are missing, and that is the protecting and restoring wetlands and riparian zones along waterways, and better management of land drainage, including erosion and sediment control. Fundamentally, we need to aim higher and try harder to achieve equitable freshwater outcomes for Canterbury's environment and society. To halt and reverse the declining trends in water quality, river flows, ecological health and public safety of our surface and groundwater waterways is a huge challenge for our whole community. Our desired freshwater outcomes must be bold, as the risk of not achieving even those proposed is real. While the proposed outcome for Mahinga kai species is supported, there needs measurable outcomes for Indigenous freshwater species important to the whole aquatic system. The Trust has proposed higher measures for desired outcomes for the Canterbury's rivers and lakes, and proposed additional outcomes for Indigenous freshwater biodiversity and the ecological health of waterways, lakes and wetlands. Consequently, the water quality limits in the Change 7 need to be consistent with achieving healthy aquatic ecosystems for our lakes and waterways. And in terms of setting the limits for groundwater, we would submit that very much a precautionary approach should be taken in that regard, given the research around the risk of colon and rectal cancers with nitrates. Fundamentally, everyone needs more certainty. A fundamental element of building social capital for sustainable management of our natural resources and environment in Canterbury is everyone understanding and implementing the duty of care for the environment. The Resource Management Act, Section 17, makes provision for this duty that applies to us all. The environmental duty of care for the landscapes and waterways of Canterbury needs to be articulated in the regional plan and referencing agreed codes of practice. Reliance on industry good practice guidelines is not enough to generate the changes needed in the timeframe set. Building knowledge and understanding of this duty and how it can be practically met in farming and other land uses will be critical to halting and reversing the adverse effects on environmental values of our landscape and waterways. Competent farm environmental planning and implementation and compliance to resource consents are ways of demonstrating this duty. There also needs to be more certainty in understanding and implementing the regional plan. There are key terms which are still that I regard as curious and ill-defined. Such terms that are used are actual and potential adverse environmental effects, the word damage, definition of a wetland, definition of a riverbank, and ecological significance. Again, clarifying those terms would clarify the story ahead. We also propose there's a need to offset our adverse effects, effectively a net gain approach. The Land and Water Regional Plan makes provision for offsetting adverse effects on the environmental values, such as wetlands and waterways. While protecting these habitats is a must, the allowance for offsetting acceptable adverse effects should be a last resort, competent, secure and governed by a clear offsets policy based on achieving a net gain in environmental values and replacement habitat. My understanding is that Environment Canterbury does not have a clear policy or administrative procedure for administering environmental offsets, and certainly hasn't been demonstrating that good practice in the past. We argued that we need to protect and restore our wetlands more so than we are doing now. All ECAN mapped wetlands on private and public lands should be protected. That is, any application to drain, divert or otherwise adversely affect an existing mapped wetland should be unacceptable and not permitted unless adequately offset, like for like, and multiplied. Existing farmlands mapped as wetlands and ground truths should be retired from farming production and managed for sediment and nutrient treatment and the ecological restoration of the wider landscape. All farm environmental plans should map land drainage and overland flow paths and connecting wetlands and plan stock exclusion and native revegetation. Our land drainage policies and practices need to change. There are significant loads of sediment entering our waterways from rural areas due to inadequate erosion and sediment control on farms and other land developments. The business as usual routine of excavating drains and waterways across rural landscapes for flood control needs to be rethought, given the increasing riparian restoration efforts and associated restrictions on the use of excavation material. A strategic network of sediment traps constructed and maintained by local governments and their drainage committees is strongly recommended to maintain waterway flow capacity and the ecological health of those waterways. We do need to improve our farm environmental planning and performance. We would advocate stronger drivers for change, for farms to further reduce nitrogen losses over time. We recommend an increase proposed percentage nitrogen reductions. That the increased proposed percentage nitrogen reductions by 30%. So effectively, to add 30% of that proposed reduction to make it stronger, and require 100% of A-rated farms audited by 2025. That needs to be coupled with effective compliance monitoring and enforcement programs that are well resourced. In terms of Schedule 7 for farm environmental plans, we need to improve erosion sediment controls in the plan. In 5E, a management area for water bodies, we would suggest additional targets related to a detailed farm drainage plan with sufficient contour intervals to plot overland flow paths for rainfall runoff and management actions to prevent and/or treat contaminated rainfall runoff from discharging to waterways, in addition to fencing off, retiring wetlands identified in the drainage plan and/or ECAN's wetlands mapping. Existing commercial tools are available for this particular technique, so that shouldn't be a limitation. In C5 management areas for cultivation and soil structure, we think we should add soil erosional stability. And in doing so, add erosion-prone areas are stabilised and retired from farming activities as necessary, and suspended sediments and overland flow of stormwater are contained and settled out before discharge to waterways. In E5 management areas for water bodies, we think we should add further targets related to the habitat of Indigenous freshwater species being protected and equally that of spawning sites for sports fisheries. And that a further target is added that the ecological health of our waterways is progressively restored. In terms of the Selwyn Tiwai additional requirements for farm environmental plans that we support, but we would also add the undertaking of riparian plantings of Indigenous vegetation, in addition of soil management requirements to maintain and improve the physical and biological condition of soils in order to minimise the movement of sediments, phosphorus and other contaminants to waterways, and to minimise and control the overland flow of suspended sediments and pathogens in stormwater. We're also advocating the requirements to protect and enhance our in-stream biodiversity values, and again, to improve how we deal with wetlands and riparian margins. We certainly support the targeted stream augmentation propositions, but see that there's too many barriers there. It's set up as effectively to protect business as usual land management operations downstream. So we think a more balanced approach would be to add a further criteria, being an assessment of the potential ecological and social benefits from the managed aquifer recharge plan, including any beneficial effects of improving the ecological health and function of a waterway or wetland and restoring degraded wetlands. And finally, that in terms of capping of the volume of water available for allocation, we believe this process should happen faster and sooner. So we have proposed tighter, I suppose, tighter constraints on those caps and a more rapid conversion of allocated groundwater and surface water back to the system. So with that, I would like to thank you again for hearing our submission and emphasise the need to align this plan with the new essential freshwater package that's before us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Patchett. Thank you for coming and presenting that. You've been presenting and reading from a summary this afternoon. Would you be agreeable to leaving that summary with our staff so that we have a record of it?
Yes, I would, Your Honour. I have actually scribbled over it. It's a bit messy at the moment. But I can arrange to send you a clean copy.
That'll be fine. But before you go, anyway, we'll have a few questions of you just to be sure we're understanding what you've come here to explain to us, and we're grateful for that. Questions of Mr. Patchett, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions of clarification. I think the original submission, you clearly set out the changes you're wanting us to consider, and you even used different colour font to make it easier for us. So no questions, thank you.
Questions, Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one on page 5 under freshwater outcomes for Canterbury Lakes. You've included a word under freshwater mahingakai species sufficiently abundant for moderate customary gathering. What did you mean by moderate?
For me, that was an attempt to try and put some extent of the recovery where it was lacking totally. So moderate was a fairly general term that if it was put into the plan, then it would be a matter of negotiating how that would manifest itself in reality. But without any sense of scale, then it's a fairly open proposition in itself as it stands.
You've cleared that up for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have no further questions.
First question, Mr. Patchett.
Sorry.
If I may.
Sure.
How many members in the organisation that's called the Water and Wildlife Habitat Trust?
We're a charitable trust, so we have 4 trustees. We're not an organisation that has members per se.
Right, I see.
We operate through a collaborative partnership model, closely working currently with ECAN, City Council, landowners, district councils. We acquire grant funding from various sponsors to carry out projects, and majority of that work done in those projects is through contracts with a bit of volunteer support.
All right, thank you for that clarification. Next question. You were talking about offsets.
Yes.
And I know that that's a controversial concept, and there's a variety of different views about how it should be governed, as it were. And I'm wanting to be clear in my mind what you see as being the desirable nature of the concept. You first mentioned that it's got to be a last resort, and I understand what you mean by that, I think. But then you were talking about how it should be managed in another way, and I'm not sure that I shouldn't give you the opportunity to tell me that again.
All right. Yeah, I have experience working with the Queensland Government with the introduction of the Biodiversity Offsets Regulation under their Environmental Protection Act. And that's probably 10 years ago. So the concept of biodiversity offsets and offsetting the impacts on the environment is not new. It does function. It can work in law. The concept is that if a proponent wishes to carry out a development that impacts on the environmental values of the environment, then part of the deal is that, well, there's options. The regulator either rejects the application, he either accepts the extent of environmental impacts and having done that is prepared to issue the approval, but subject to offsetting that impact in a net gain scenario so that the development can go ahead. There is a negative impact on the environment that is compensated with a positive net gain in that type of environmental loss.
Well, thank you. So you're recommending that there's a good model in Queensland?
Absolutely. That's only one example, but that is a functioning biodiversity offsets regulatory framework that's it's tried and true.
Thank you. Next question is about the evidence that you say exists concerning nitrates and colorectal cancer. What is the evidence that you rely on in that regard?
My evidence is really effectively feeding off the media coverage on that topic, and the reference to the research papers that
we've had some experts in front of us, and I thought, well, maybe you could be contributing to that. But if yours is based on the media, I think we'll look to the experts who've come face to face before us.
That's very
Now, a final question is about the managed aquifer recharge, and you had some comments about that, and I think you were recommending an additional consideration of social benefits. And you also, as I remember in the submission, you were talking about the effects of the recharge on the water level in the aquifer. Now, I'm not quite clear about how the social benefits come into that. Would you like to just explain that to me?
When I read the proposition about the, I suppose, the qualifiers or the criteria for deciding on those the augmentation plans, it seemed to me that there was a lot of safeguards for downstream land users. Effectively, what it looked like was you could have stream augmentation, but not if it caused any effect to downstream farming activities, which, for my view on it, would put a serious limitation on the application of that technique to recharge some of our streams. It seemed to me we needed a more balanced approach, and the two elements in our submission were related to considering the benefits of both the ecological health improvements you might get with more surface water in springs and wetland areas, as well as the social benefits across the board in a general sense to the community from healthier waterways and maybe more swimmable watering holes and safer swimming holes.
I see. Well, Mr. Patchett, we're grateful to you for coming in and explaining the submission that you put in earlier. And we understand it is quite a comprehensive submission. You've put a lot of time into it. We're grateful to you for that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, my view of the audience, as it were, is not as clear as it would be, but do I see Ms. Ham there to represent Trustpower?
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Vanessa Ham. I appear as counsel for Trustpower, and with me is Nicola Foran from Trustpower Limited.
Welcome to you both. There's something funny about sound, yeah? But I understand. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Now, you should have before you legal submissions, which I have filed in advance, together with the statement of evidence from Ms. Foran.
Yes. Yes, we have both of those. And we've read them all. And so you don't need to read it all to us, but you can manage the case in your usual professional way, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you, sir. What I intend to do is just give a brief introduction or overview of my legal submissions rather than go through them, and then pass over to Ms. Foran to present on behalf of Trustpower. So just by way of summary, Trustpower is in the business of generating hydroelectricity, power generation, and within the Canterbury region, it has the Coleridge and Montalto and Highbank assets. And Coleridge is really the focus of its submission today. Its interest in Plan Change 7 is relatively discrete. It arises as a result of the Indigenous freshwater habitat species overlay, specifically in relation to the Lake Coleridge, the Coleridge scheme at Lake Coleridge, and the impact that the overlay has on existing structures which are necessary for the scheme to function. So Trustpower has sought in its submission some amendments to the planning maps to remove the overlay from the area of some of the structures which are part of the scheme, and it has also sought amendments to a small number of policies and rules on the basis that those amendments are required to more appropriately integrate the protection of Indigenous biodiversity with the operation and specifically the maintenance activities associated with the operation of the Coleridge scheme. And I am happy to go through those amendments in more detail if that is helpful to the Commissioners, but otherwise, if you have pre-read the submission, you may prefer that I just leave it there.
Well, for myself, I'm content with that, but let's see if there are questions arising. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yeah, just one question that's probably addressed to you both collectively, and it just derives out of para 16 of the legal submissions, where you say the preferable relief or outcome you're seeking would be to deliver certainty through the mapping layer. Now, other hydroelectricity generator submitters, Genesis and Meridian, have provided us with quite detailed maps with us seeking larger exclusion zones around their assets. I don't think you've done the same, or have you?
There are maps attached to Trustpower's submission, so if you have that to hand, I can take you to that.
And have those changed since then, or are you still satisfied with the ones that were initially lodged?
They're largely the same, although I do acknowledge that was fairly crude mapping from our point of view. They will need to be refined in the GIS sort of tools. But they were the two critical aspects of the scheme that we wanted removed from that critical habitats layer to provide that certainty for all that they're not part of that layer, and that was the weir of the entrance of the Oakton Canal, so that was figure 1 of Appendix A, and then the area around where the water intakes are, so that was figure 2 of Appendix A, and that consists of the 2 intakes and the structures, the breakwaters and the groins. So there's a few different assets and structures going on in that area.
Okay, just a minute.
Yep.
So the figures at the back.
Appendix A.
Yeah.
That's to the submission of Trustpower.
Yeah. Okay.
What we didn't include, or what Trustpower didn't seek in its submission, was the removal of the habitats overlayer from the lake stream, which is at the northwestern end of the lake, and instead we only have minor monitoring structures there for monitoring water levels and so forth. So instead we just wanted those rules to reflect though that its existing structure should remain and be maintained.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, so thanks for reminding me of that. So the Appendix A maps, they're still fit for purpose then in terms of your relief?
Yes.
Okay. Right, that was the only issue I wanted to clarify. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, is there anything you'd like to ask of Ms. Ham in respect of her introduction to the case?
No, and I have no questions for Ms. Hand, thank you.
Yeah. Well, nor have I, Ms. Ham. Thank you. But I do thank you for your legal submissions. Shall we then come to Ms. Foran's evidence?
Yes.
You won't need to read it to us, Ms. Foran, but we thank you for it and we have read it. But there may be some questions for you about it. So just give me a moment to bring it to the screen. I will start by asking if there's anything that you want to correct or bring up to date in the statement that you made.
Yes, Commissioner. Just one point in regards to policy 4.102. So Trustpower's submission sought some amendments to that, and then in considering the reporting officer's report, which was recommended to delete that policy, obviously Trustpower, and in my opinion we supported that. I just wanted to clarify and add that if the hearings panel decided to retain that policy for other reasons, I know there was a lot of discussion on the intent of that policy and fish passage and preventing pest species and so forth. So if it was decided to retain that policy, then I would still recommend that the amendments sought by Trustpower and its submission are carried through.
That's clear. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Foran? Commissioner Van Veldhuizen?
No, I already asked the question I had in mind, so thank you.
You, Commissioner Solomon?
I don't have any questions about her evidence, but I just have one general question. And I know that Trustpower probably does do a whole lot from as far as environmental protection goes, but maybe if you could just explain some of what you do as far as environmental restoration or protection.
Sure.
And
Yeah, so it's not the area that I work specifically in, but in my knowledge, in the Coleridge area, we have the Coleridge Habitat Enhancement Trust. So Trustpower provides funding into that trust, and we have people that participate within that process, and that's really looking at enhancing the habitat in and around Lake Coleridge. I think funding goes out for pest management, pest control, those sorts of issues, any sort of initiatives around enhancing habitat for freshwater species. And we also have the Whakamato Eel Trust, which similarly is there to enhance the habitat and the populations of tuna in the area.
that's the one that I've heard of.
Yes.
So thank you for explaining that for me. I have no further questions.
Well, I have no questions for Ms. Foran either. We're grateful for the evidence statement which is provided.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Ham, where would you like to take it from there?
Well, I think that concludes the case for Trustpower, the submissions and evidence having been presented and questions having been asked and answered. So on behalf of Trustpower, I just thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming in and perhaps a long journey for you, but thank you.
It's no problem. Thank you.
Is this Mr. Hill?
Yes, it is, Your Honour.
Well, thank you for coming, Mr. Hill, and thank you for providing us a summary statement and printing it in red to make sure we understand its importance, which we do.
It was just to highlight the update, really, but thank you. Yes. Kia ora, Commissioners. Yeah, I'd just like to say, look, I'm not a member of Forest and Bird or Federated Farmers or any other group that's related to water users. I I live in St Albans with my wife and 2 children, and I think Christchurch is very lucky to have the water that we do have, and it's worth protecting. And sadly, it's going backwards, let's face it. So I've obviously got some working knowledge of the RMA and stuff, but I'm certainly no expert, and I don't have any technical knowledge at all. But I have endeavoured to follow the debate fairly closely. As I said here, I attended most of the Christchurch West Melton Zone Committee meetings between 2015 up to the 22nd of February 2018, at which time I think both the Christchurch West Melton Zone Committee and the Waimakariri Zone Committee lost their way, and that they decided that they would then go and meet behind closed doors and make decisions about the water in Christchurch. Not a good look at all, and very poor form. And ultimately, I think the WIMAC committee decided, well, hey, we after the City Council intervention decided, well, hey, we're going to do our own thing anyway. So I think the government intervention in 2010 and the whole process has been a massive failure, and while I fully support what's going on in 2020, I think ultimately that's going to have significant challenges as well. And having watched a lot of the videos of the farming community coming here, you can see that it's the whole thing's going to be pretty hard work, and you guys have got a pretty hard job ahead of you, there's no doubt about that. I suppose, I think one of the most disappointing things is that urban public have really given up communicating with ECAN. They're not feeling involved and they're not feeling listened to. We've got no time for people taking our water for water bottling. We don't have time for chlorination, and we're not going to have any time for people who want to pollute it with nitrates. So it's a very difficult thing, and I think Environment Canterbury needs to get its head around the fact that we want to see improvements in water quality, and that's what the law and their own plans say, but they're not delivering on that. So, and obviously we're getting more. The public who aren't happy are getting more proper feedback from the government, or the government seems to be listening to what's being heard. So, I know there's. As you hear all the farmers, I totally, they can't afford to go backwards. It's crazy. They're not going to farm if they're not going to make any money, and why would they? But the whole thing's costing a lot of money as well. You would have heard from the Christchurch City Council. So Christchurch ratepayers, if you add up what the City Council, they're going to spend $44 million on CapEx, $32 million in operational expenditure this year, topped on with what we chip into the Environment Canterbury CWS, another $23 to $25 million. Christchurch ratepayers are only going to spend $100 million this year on water. So, and going forward for the next, I think the council goes out for 30 years in their LTP. So, there's a significant cost as well. That's just for Christchurch. I fully support the NPS FM20. Obviously, it's going to be bringing in now, obviously, is going to have a massive effect on what your work ends up being. So certainly my original submission, I said, well, you should go back to square one, because there hasn't been the involvement of the Christchurch public. But I think probably now you just need to get on and do something is the main thing. There needs to be some improvements made. So the time frame, I'm sure everybody's talked about the time frame, but a 60-year plan just, to achieve what's needed is too long. There's been a strategy in place for 10 years now. It was a strategy out till 2040. If you start at one thing and then you decide you're going to do the farming tactic, you're going to go down the path and industrialise farming and do all that first and then clean up the mess later. Let's have no debate about that. I think that's true. Then it's a bit hard to say, well, actually, hey, we need another 50 years to clean up the mess. My view is you've got your 30 years, so things need to be sorted out within 2040. I don't really have a lot else to add there. Obviously, I have made some comments there about managed aquifers. I just see them as another, they're an underground storage facility as opposed to above ground storage facility. They just mean more cows, so I don't see any need to have those. I don't see benefits. So, yeah, that's really all I've got to say. Thank you for listening to my submission and, yeah, if you've got any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hill. We did want you to come and say what you had in your mind, and that's what you've done, and I'm glad you felt able to do that. But I hope you're not misunderstanding in the sense that we are not Environment Canterbury. We are independent commissioners, and our role is not to look at grievances about the past process, but to look to see what amendments can be made to the plan change to improve it. And that's where the constructive part of your submission is what we've got in mind particularly, and we're grateful to you for that. I'll see if my colleagues have any questions of you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I thought Mr Hill's submission was quite clear. Thank you.
Well, Mr Hill, thank you very much for coming in and for giving us the understanding that we now have about your views on all of this. Thank you very much indeed.
Mihi, thank you.
Now we'd like to consider the submission of the New Zealand Deer Farmers Association.
Yes, thank you, Your Honour. We'll just spend 30 seconds just to get ourselves a bit organised and pull up our PowerPoint. Yes, well, if I may commence.
So you're Mr. Peck, is it?
Sorry, yes. So I'm Lindsay Fong. I'm from Deer Industry, New Zealand. So just to introduce the speakers that we have today, to my left, immediate left, is Graham Peck, the chair of the South Canterbury North Otago branch of the Deer Farmers Association. And then to his left is Russell Rudd, the chair of the Canterbury West Coast branch.
Well, gentlemen, welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've sent us a presentation and some notes about winter grazing and some notes about planning for winter deer. So we have all of that, and we're looking forward to you presenting it as is comfortable for you.
Thank you. Yes, so just to outline what we're going to go through today, so we're not going to sort of dwell too much on our submission or our summary statement, but just pick out some of the eyes of that and demonstrate that in terms of what that looks like on several deer farms.
Good idea. Thank you.
Yep. So we do note that the Woodbury Environment Group, Great Southern Farms and Blair Farming have already commented on winter grazing requirements in the OTOP zone. So we do endorse their comments and their approaches, and we just have a very quick summary points which Graham will present.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Peck.
Yeah, well, on the winter grazing in the OTOP zone, we think that the requirement for a consent for over 20 hectares of winter feed has been superseded by the national water regulations. The 10% or 10 degree slope rules pretty much cover most of the zone and definitely the high risk zones. And we think that the 10% feed of winter feed area in the main Plan Change 7 is more than adequate to cover the risks involved for that. So that's my comment on that. To go to the intermittent springs, you have a picture of an intermittent spring with some people's feet around it. That is on my farm. It runs for probably 1 month, twice a year when the water levels are very high. It's right in the middle of a very narrow gully, and would it be extremely difficult to fence, especially as it's deer fenced, and it would be difficult to manage the rest of the paddock around that. It has got very high side, steep side one side on the left. We do use it for deer sometimes when it is wet, but the deer can go up the side and find dry areas to lay and don't pug up the bottom. The water, when it comes out, runs through that grass, and so it's filtered, and then it runs down to a creek which we have fenced, and we've got, it's not riparian planted, but it's got long grass in it. Because the deer go on to winter feed, there would be no stock in those paddocks for June, July and August. So another risk taken away from that. So that's that one. I think the fencing off of the small spring would be extremely costly and just be too hard. So we then go to another picture, which is a spring on well, we've got the picture on the next page of the creek that it runs into, and it's very well filtered before it gets there. The next spring is on a very steep hillside, would be very difficult to fence. It runs down into a creek, and we're going to fence the creek, but we're just investigating at the moment. It's 9 hectares, and it will be $35,000 just for culvert pipes to get access, because it's more than 45 degrees one side of the creek and a small area of flat that we require to get the stock to, so that we can supplementary feed them. And then we've got probably 500 metres of fence both sides, a kilometre, so we're looking at another $25,000. And so we've seen this problem building up, and the final slide for me is the current mitigation, where we've retired 330 metres of the stream where it leaves the farm and we have a sediment trap there as well. So my case is that intermittent springs are probably too hard at the moment. What we would like to do, as farmers, we're wholeheartedly in support of improving water quality. We started testing water quality coming on and leaving the farm 2 years ago, but we've got to give it a bit of time to see whether we're making any improvement. We've been gradually fencing waterways for more than 8 years now. We're working through it slowly. We could see this coming, and we just need to be at a financially sustainable pace to keep this going. And to get the best outcomes, we've got to pick off the easiest places to get the best outcomes first. So that's my comments so far. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Peck. So would you like us to ask any questions person by person as they speak, or would you rather we kept questions till the end? What suits you best, Mr. Fung?
I think if you have any questions in your mind that you'd like to ask Graham, then probably just raise them as they arise. Yeah, and we'll have Russell on after that. So.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Peck, Commissioner Van Berlhuizen?
No questions, but just a couple of comments. I think you've provided us again with a copy of your environmental code of practice, and I think in previous hearings, Mr. Fung, we've complimented you on the quality of that, so just like to repeat that appreciation now. It is a very good document. You've also raised a couple of issues that are very much in our minds. One is the overlap of the plan provisions with the RM stock exclusion regulations and the NESFM regarding how it deals with intensive grazing. So that's an issue before us that we're going to have to put our minds to. And the other issue you've raised is the definition of springs and how that affects what's required to be done in regard to them. And that's also an issue that we're going to have to deal with, and other submitters have raised that. So just letting you know that we're aware of those issues that you've brought to our attention.
A comment I would make is the same, that we see the rules coming, but we don't have any real definition of what they apply to.
Yeah.
And I would say that is holding back what we do, because we want to do the most important things first, and we don't want to waste money on something that won't be in the rules. We need that to go what will be in the rules.
Yeah, and just another comment. I mean, the picture that you had of the spring on the steep hillside, I mean, that could be very much the same picture I've seen at hearings in Northland and Southland. So it's a nationwide issue, not just a Canterbury issue. So thanks. No actual questions.
Commissioner Solomon, is there anything you'd like to ask Mr. Pegg?
No questions from me, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So, do we come to Mr. Rudd next? Is he going to speak to us?
Yes, that's right.
Yep. Yes. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Rudd. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak here today. I farm deer near Rangiora in the Waimaka zone. I've been farming deer since 1995, firstly in Rapara outside of Blenheim. In 2009, we moved south to Canterbury onto 600 hectares, and our deer herd has now reached 400 breeding hinds. I'm the current chair of the Canterbury Deer Farmers Association for the Canterbury West Coast branch, and I've held this position for 4 years. I have here a few photos and examples of springs and artificial waterways on more gentle topography from my farm, and another one near Sheffield. This first picture is a little bit difficult to make out, but it's actually a swale, or you might like to call it a rain-fed drain, but it does come up after very heavy rainfall, and particularly in spring. And similar to Graham's pictures, it's filtered by grass. It is, however, no different from the rest of the paddock except for one important aspect, and the hinds are falling in there right at the moment. When fawns are born in November, the hind will leave to forage before returning to feed the fawn. Fawns seek out a hiding place and remain motionless. As this is a more intensive farm where large cover is not prevalent, small hollows, when dry, can still provide cover for the newborn fawn for about 2 weeks. Excluding stock from this area would compromise this farm's ability to stock deer. Note that fawns will not hide in wet areas, but fencing off these intermittent springs would reduce options for fawns and increase mortality rates. Next picture. This picture here, if you can imagine, I've turned 180 degrees from where the fawn was, looking into the adjacent paddock, and the arrow is actually pointing the wrong way. It should be pointing to the left. So the water that does come up occasionally would flow down through that area very slowly, only at walking speed, once again filtered by the grass that's grown through there. I've been on this property for nearly 12 years now, and the water's only flown through here about 3 times, so it's not really a big issue, and we think we can deal with these things through our farm environmental plan. And the question would be, how would we deer fence the stream when we have no idea when it would decide to flow next? Last picture. This picture's from Sheffield on Stu Stokes' property. This spring-fed drain is fenced off as the paddocks are intensively grazed. It flows for 3 months. After 18 months, the weed control will need to be controlled. Grazing stock is clearly not practical or desirable, and brown hemlock is toxic. But the only options would seem to be the use of chemicals, and it's really an unintended consequence of fencing off the stream. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rudd. The photographs are very helpful to us to for understanding. Any questions for Mr. Rudd, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen,
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I don't either, but the fawn is really cute.
Well, we always learn from every submitter. Thank you. Now, Mr. Fung, where do we come to now?
Right, so I'll just finish things off, and it's really more of a bit about some of the extra bits that we put in our submission about the deer industry initiatives and how that might sort of help environmental management in general, but with respect to Plan Change 7. Before I do that, I'd just like to touch on a couple of points which we made in our summary statement about comments in the Section 42A report. And that they made recommendations for springs to have downstream connections and only exclude stock when they contain water. As we mentioned, that still remains, that's a good step in the right direction, but it still remains impractical for deer farming. And that's partly because stock exclusion for deer farming does mean permanent fencing. And so it's really still the default option, regardless of the level of risk or ability to put in place alternative mitigations. So we also sort of queried how or sort of sought further clarification of what downstream connection would mean. As you've seen from those photos, particularly that one on the steep hillside, there's certainly a downstream connection. It's just not a defined channel, but it's flowing down into the stream below, so that's a connection. Yeah, so I guess further clarification on that would be quite helpful. We also were a bit bemused when the authors suggest that because we do have that code of practice and we've identified ways to mitigate fence pacing, these could be employed following stock exclusion. So one of our points was that if you start putting up more fences on deer farms where deer naturally need space to move around and that, you start to create these areas where they may feel more under stress and as a result start to pace the fence. So when we pointed that out, the comment was that, well, you've got a code of practice that addresses fence pacing, so you've got a solution. And I guess that just sort of seemed to us to mean that in the first instance, in those examples, for example, that you've seen there, where we think there's low risk, you're requiring the farmer to put in, go to an expense to exclude stock and then create a further risk of fence pacing and then mitigate that. And so that sort of leads us on to this slide here where we provided an example of where wallowing close to a recently fenced off stream up in the Waikato was a bit of a perverse outcome. So prior to that fence going up, there was no wallowing. Putting that fence in, a few weeks later, the wallow appeared. And those things which we can't predict will happen. Although I suppose that the fence pacing is slightly different if we put a fence up, and we know that the area is going to be restrictive. Then the risk of that fence pacing is greatly enhanced. Whereas wallows we can't predict. But that's just an example of unforeseen outcomes or additional things that we have to consider. But on that same farm, where most of the hill country hadn't been fenced off, in fact all of it hadn't, and just areas on the flats that had been fenced, this farm was also a regional monitoring site for stream health. And it's interesting just to show that the results from about a year ago, where they looked at the MCI score relative to native forest, which was 134. There were 60 sites in the region, and the average of those were 102. On this particular deer farm, the MCI score was 120. So not quite as good as native forest, but a bit better than the average. And on that site, Kura, long finial, short finial were all present. So we just refer to that as an example of where a lightly stocked farm that does not exclude stock from all waterways but implements good management practice can both farm livestock and maintain good ecological stream health. And in this catchment, the priority is on minimising sediment and phosphorus loss. So no different in that respect from concerns in the OTOP zone. So as mentioned, back in May 2018, we did release our code of practice. It's been well taken up since then, and it has been designed to complete a farm environment plan. We are currently working on an addition to that, which we hope to publish early in 2021, which is essentially a handbook which contains a lot more examples, some real on-farm examples of what GMPs are. So lots of photographs of GMPs, a few examples of what poor management practice might be, and also templates of various farm systems and how you might construct a farm environment plan for those farm systems. So in the supporting information that I provided you, there are two dear facts. So these are additional information that's been developed through our industry government partnership program, Passion to Profit. We've got about 7 of these on environment issues, and the 2 that I've provided you, I guess, sort of refer to the topic around winter grazing in the OTOP zone, but obviously that's a topic that's been in the national spotlight, and we have developed some resources as a result of that. The other initiative that we have done around environmental management back in 2015, so it's a few years ago now, we commissioned Land Care Trust to create 15 videos on deer farming around sustainable management. So there were in batches of 5. There were 5 done in Canterbury, 5 around Southland, and 5 in Hawke's Bay. And they cover a range of topics. So this one's on land and environment plans or farm environment plans. This one's around catchment management, and then we have ones on soil and water and riparian management. So there's a range of those ones. The link is provided there, and hopefully you might have been able to access them through the files that we provide you, and we'll provide the slides at the end. So if you want to peruse that, then you're more than welcome to. So the South Canterbury North Otago and the Canterbury West Coast branches are also working alongside Environment Canterbury. For 3 years now, we've run independent audit training days where they visit deer farms and are provided a view of environmental issues and deer farming practices. In 2019, so this is was covered in our industry news publication, auditors undertook a mock audit of a deer farm, which is one of the farms which was featured in our presentation, and the farmer actually is Stu Stokes, who's right behind me. They took a mock audit of the deer farm, and then a couple of weeks later the results were discussed with local deer farmers, and we reported that quite extensively in our deer industry news, as I mentioned. In September this year, we also ran another auditor training day with the South Canterbury North Otago branch for deer winter grazing management, and that was held at one of the farms in the Woodbury Environment Group that you heard from about a month ago down in Timaru. So really, just to round things off, both branches are very proactive and are keen to extend an invitation to collaborate with Environment Canterbury, to ensure that deer farmers complete and action their farm plans, minimise their environmental impacts, and we would wish to see policies and rules in Plan Change 7 that encourage such collaboration. So thank you for hearing our concerns.
Well, you've gone to a lot of trouble for us in your original submission and in the presentation that you've presented here. You've come in today to make sure that we understand it all, as we do, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that's all the submissions that we have today. So I'll adjourn the hearing now until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.